You know, if great art in all its forms inspires you, because that's largely where I get my inspiration from, and you wonder how great artists even begin to do what they do, or you feel stuck in your own art or creativity or just in life, Think Like an Artist by Will Gompertz is really going to help. And look, spoiler alert, I love this book, and I really think you might just do as well. It helps you understand how arguably some of the greatest artists that ever lived, people who've had a real impact on society, overcame very simple human problems, which were huge blockers. No matter the art form, no matter the century, or the challenges we face as creatives, or even in our daily lives, they're way more universal than maybe our introspective brains kind of let us believe. And I think it's a great reminder that we can overcome hurdles. You know, these people started off as people like us, overcoming problems that we all go through, and I think there's a difference in how we approach it versus they approach it, and that is often the secret sauce, overcoming resistance that we all face in unique ways. So what I thought I'd do is I would share with you exactly what clicked about me the most for this book, and I guess some of my own observations and takes on this stuff as well. Because a lot of what I'm going to say in this video is in the spirit of the book. It's what I've learned from the book and then gone on to learn from some of the artists featured in there and more. So not everything I share is going to come from it, but it was all absolutely inspired by the intent of it. Now look, once you get to the end of the video, let the rest of us all know in the comments whose mindset or whose approach or whose thought process you've been inspired by too. I think it's so fascinating, and we might just all end up inspiring each other or somebody else, you know, making a change in one person's life. And there's so much more in the book than I can talk about in this video today, without just reading you the whole book, and I think that'd probably be copyright infringement, so I'm not going to do that. So let's dive in. I want to share some of the stuff that I've taken from it. I think one of the big things perhaps that a lot of people struggle with, and I think it's perhaps a lesson that in the book we learn a little bit from Caravaggio, the painter, but talking about how passion and big picture thoughts sort of distill into the finite details that people need to complete a work of art. I think a lot of people perhaps assume that when they start things that focusing on details can get in the way of passion sometimes and water it down, and don't want to slow down, if that makes sort of sense. Now, I'm not going to give you a full art history lesson here, but this guy lived this crazy, fast-paced life with partying and getting drunk and even attempted murder, apparently. It was absolutely nuts, hanging out with all sorts of people, doing crazy things. But in his work, he became obsessed with light and how it worked, and he studied it, and he studied optics, sort of how glass reflects light and things like that, and tried to replicate that in his paintings, exploring the detail between the contrast of light and dark. What he did was, he really focused on that, and even when he couldn't afford to pay models, he started using mirrors to do self-portraits and looked at how light interacted with him and to express his passion and his struggles through those paintings. And those fine details that he focused on, even though he was channeling his passion and his struggle, they changed the world of art. They introduced a new way of painting that will basically go on to influence artists, filmmakers, content creators nowadays. If you think about contrasty lighting that creates those really moody scenes in things like Mean Streets by Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now and The Godfather, I think of Blade Runner, I think of Alien even. I would argue he's indirectly influenced people all over social media without them even realizing, because they're copying films that have used Caravaggio-inspired lighting. It's pretty crazy. Bringing it back to this takeaway from the book then. It's the details that give us that long-lasting impact, the deliberate choices we make. And then talking about detail, he goes on to talk about artists like Rembrandt and Peter Doig, and how Rembrandt would balance great big compositions with finite facial details, or Doig would lay a Membrian landscape to sort of create these sort of really unique works, doing a landscape that focuses on these tiny details to communicate the feeling and the intent that he wanted to put in. I think the lesson here then perhaps is that driving passion in any art must speak to and sort of drive the small details to really connect with people, because even if people don't overtly understand those small details, those are a huge part of what creates their experience with your art form or your work, whatever it is. But it's important to zoom in on ideas, to show what is important, to guide your viewer, in the same way a director points a camera at a specific object on screen. You know, it's interesting, it reminded me a bit, like if you come back to the business world, of Steve Jobs and his approach to products and businesses, really sweating the small details, making things look beautiful on the inside as well as the outside when he didn't need to, because it was hidden by the shell of a product, things that people would never see, because those details sort of do matter. The craftsmanship in things does matter.
And I think this is more important than people realize, because it changes your audience's relationship to your art or your product and creates this intentionality and this feeling of worth that work with no attention to detail misses. And we see this so much now in modern consumer culture. Think the Temu versions of everything versus the real thing with art and electronics or clothing or anything. It just kind of feels empty and hollow, and it's sort of in a way people can't quantify. So they ignore it and move on and keep buying the stuff.
And I think then if we look at sort of where art intersects with business, something Steve Jobs talked a lot about, and I won't yak on about him, is actually a lesson from Andy Warhol. And this has really clicked for me in unashamedly treating creativity like a business. I think I've resisted that in the past, and this is why it connected with me. And on reflection, I really don't know why, because it's such a critical part of creating art. Andy Warhol famously built the factory. He had assistants reproducing things for him. He thought about scaling his output as much as he possibly could. And it reminds me a lot of, if you've ever seen Exit Through the Gift Shop, the Banksy documentary, Mr. Brainwash in that, who was really inspired by that. The other thing Warhol did, and Mr. Brainwash too, is controlled supply and demand, limited releases, creating scarcity around things so people want them more. Warhol was actually quoted as saying, making money is art and working is art and good business is the best art. We see this so much nowadays in this world where there's limited edition drops of absolutely everything. Merging commerce with art, insisting business is part of the creative process is so critical. And in the online world, I think of people like Peter McKinnon, whose work and his products I love, and he's brought that into the digital age so well. And if you look at the absolute extreme of this, maybe not on a limited scarcity thing, but Mr. Beast is greater business versus his art as well. A lot of people would argue it isn't art. Look, I'm not here to criticize him though. I think it teaches us that then thinking about your systems, your branding, distribution, they can all be part of the creative process, and it could perhaps even influence the final product. And perhaps that can be okay, and it doesn't always cheapen your art. Also, for those of us who are really not business-minded, I think perhaps, it teaches us a lot about maybe how we should have collaborators who are, and work with people who can do that for us. Also, before we move on, because we're discussing business, just really quickly, I have made a playlist of some videos where I've shared some of the advice I wish people had sort of taught me earlier on in my career. I'm someone who's been really lucky. I've been lucky enough to work in my chosen creative field. I have ended up making a living from it. It's linked below, and I'll put a card at the end of the video with it on it as well. But yeah, check that out if you are interested. Okay, so look, back to Warhol. That constant output is something that lined up with somebody else you might have heard of 75 years prior to him, who also features in the book. I mean, this is another fascinating one, is Vincent van Gogh. As well as that consistency, we can learn a big lesson about embracing failure and keeping going. And he produced hundreds and hundreds of paintings and sketches despite sort of a lot of rejection throughout his lifetime. And he had all these letters that he wrote that sort of showed that he felt he had a duty to keep making work without waiting for recognition. He would treat failure as this inevitable thing that he had to survive through, but something which was a step forward for him, which I think is fascinating. And this is something I needed to hear. I think volume of work and persistence really does matter. A lot of YouTube gurus speak about this, don't they? But persistence through failure can really build momentum and confidence. You learn so much from failures. He literally said, it is also absolutely my duty to try and make money by my work, even if his greatness perhaps wasn't truly recognized until later on, after he passed, unfortunately. He went on to change the world with his art. He's one of the most renowned artists ever to have lived. Isn't that crazy? So I wanted to take a small but very relevant departure to another artist who isn't one of the ones featured in the book, but this is absolutely a thought inspired by the book's approach. I read about Leonardo da Vinci, you may have heard of him. He experimented across a lot of different disciplines, and I think that in itself is so relevant and so cool, and a topic the book does touch on. He's this incredible example of this person who had so many different interests and things he was focused on. He had these famous notebooks that blended everything from anatomy to engineering to botany to art, drawing pictures of plants. And he refused to kind of silo knowledge, I guess. And look, this is the guy who drew helicopters 500 years before they were even built. He would jump between a lot of sort of fine details, from big picture things like muscle structures, going to architecture, the structure of plant, going to a device that sort of might be designed to fly. It's a really important lesson about curiosity across different fields, cross-pollinating each other, so people can make connections that someone who's just focused on a single discipline might not see. Also, another really incredible thing about Da Vinci, and look, this isn't in the book, and this is very much something that's definitely a theory, but in 2019, these people published this paper proposing that Leonardo da Vinci displayed traits consistent with ADHD. And it does seem really compelling if you look at the evidence. He had all these different unfinished projects, commissions he would abandon, he'd jump rapidly between different disciplines. See the picture it sort of paints? He would jump from anatomy to flight to painting to engineering. He worked apparently in really irregular bursts and lived quite an erratic lifestyle. And he was very self-critical, and he thought he didn't live up to his own potential. And, you know, when he passed, he did leave a lot of unfinished works behind or abandoned. But all these behaviors mirror what everyone knows is ADHD today. Difficulty with task completion, shifting focus, really restless curiosity. And from what we know about him, apparently this did frustrate him. But also those traits drove him to cross-pollinate ideas from human anatomy to architecture, in all sorts of other disciplines, making him who he was and centuries ahead of his time. If someone like Da Vinci had these traits and could potentially struggle with them and still leave behind that legacy that he did, it kind of reframes it, not as a block to doing great things, but perhaps as an engine for it. And it's really inspiring for those of us who have it, because these traits that frustrate us day to day can also fuel this originality, these great innovations in art and world-changing ideas, which is just nuts, I think, and so cool. So yeah, ultimately the lesson here, and something that the book does talk about, is this ability to connect ideas that nobody else could, and it made him one of the greatest minds that ever lived. And, you know, 500 years later, we're still talking about him, still looking at his work. It's kind of nuts. But anyway, let's get back to the actual stuff from the book. I think perhaps something that maybe applied to Da Vinci too, it looks at courage and taking risks and pushing boundaries, and how it ties into who an artist is and even what they stand for. Ai Weiwei, I want to start with, he's been in the news recently for speaking up about the Palestine situation. He's had a whole bunch of exhibitions cancelled, but he's throughout his career used his art to shine a light on human rights abuses, corruption, and he's really fiercely spoken out, even when he was under house arrest and probably in great danger, I'm guessing. And he has actually said recently that culture is a form of soft power. This represents a method of soft violence aimed at stifling voices. It's not directed solely at me, but at the broader culture of a society lacking a spiritual immune system. Ouch. When a society cannot withstand diverse voices, it teeters on the brink of collapse. And it's such a powerful, profound statement, isn't it? So look, while not every artist is political or even needs to be, the commonality is that most successful and impactful artists and people who create things never back down from their ideals. Another person like that, but totally different, is Marina Abramović. She has pushed herself to the absolute kind of like limits of endurance and challenged the norms of kind of what's culturally acceptable through her performance and her installation art, where she's allowed the public to do things like do whatever they want to her. She broke up with her partner on the Great Wall of China, and she's lined corridors with naked bodies, all this sort of like crazy stuff. I'm really kind of like condensing this into a nutshell, and I hate doing that. But what she teaches us, like Weiwei, is that how courage and sticking to your values can be so central to creative work. Thinking about these people, and so many more of the artists in the book, I think going where it's uncomfortable, taking risks, being brave, not only sort of fuel creativity and make you feel better about yourself, but create art with a greater impact too that lasts generations. Abramovich said it's not easy. It takes everything, every atom of your energy to be there and do these things. With that in mind then, that singular commitment to like values and someone's persona and what they put out into the world, Gilbert George, who said, make the world believe in you and pay heavily for the privilege. They made their personas completely inseparable from their art in a very different way, and it's a masterclass in what people would probably call personal branding now. And look, I hate that term. It's such a dollified concept on social media where people come up with lots of logos and stuff like that and think that's enough, that's my personal brand.
I think we've put together some great ideas for your brand. I understand you want people to like you more and think you're cool. Is that right?
Yeah.
Kyle, rugged, vegan, compassionate victim.
So people like Abramovich, Weiwei, Gilbert and George, they bring this public identity to life as a performance. And consistency in that becomes an artistic medium in itself. Your persona or your chosen persona can be this incredibly powerful tool. And thinking about others who are not in the book that I've looked up to and I've been inspired by that exemplify this. Hunter S. Thompson, wow. Anthony Bourdain.
People like Lady Gaga, people like Lana DelRay. King of this in the music industry was David Bowie, who changed persona so often. The common thread these people all have is they take things that are inherent parts of their personality, or the parts of their personality that they want to share with the public, and they create these characters around them, these mythologies around them. They create these larger-than-life figures that become this sort of fictionalized version of themselves.
You know what I think it is, though, about these people that really sets them apart? And it's not these performances necessarily, it's not these characters, although those are so critical for like making an initial connection with people and wowing people enough to stop them, that it's none of these people ever gave up on what it is they were trying to put out there into the world, what they were trying to communicate to the world. And it goes for every great artist in this book, and I think if you really look at great artists on a larger scale, perhaps every great artist who's ever really made an impact on the world, they have a key sort of message and a belief and sort of a purpose, and whether they share that with you or not overtly, that's what sets them apart. And if you read between the lines with so many of these people, you can start to see that. It's pretty incredible once you start to sort of pick up on this. And if you think of this then like a mission statement for each of those people, as corporate and as bland as that sounds, you start to see this thing shine through with all of these people, this purpose, this vision that they have, that no matter how many changes they make in their career, like someone like Bowie, they will stick to this key core value, this key sort of thing that they're doing, which just connects with the world and gives a longevity to their work that others just don't have.
Sometimes they blur the lines between fiction and reality. There was an incredible movie that really explored this that Casey Affleck and Joaquin Phoenix made called I'm Still Here, which was actually chronicling the downfall of a fictionalized version of Joaquin Phoenix. They took it a step further and turned the making of this film into a social experiment where they convinced the world that he really was having a breakdown and quitting acting and becoming a hip-hop star. It's a must-watch. I'm Still Here. It's an incredible film and definitely worth checking out.
And it's made me think about all of this. Why do I bother creating stuff? And I'm not putting myself in the same category as any of the other people in this book. I don't believe I am. But reflecting on my own journey, I guess what I want to do falls really in line with what this book does so well. It's sharing the joy that is thinking in a more creative way too. And I think it's perhaps the great artists across all of the art forms, all the different art forms, who experience and discover and try and live up to, as much as possible, this addictive sense of creative flow that is perhaps kind of akin to how I understand the concept of sort of living in a bliss state or an enlightenment state, as I understand it. And I think all the rest of us, me included in the rest of us, get these small tastes of that feeling, these small tastes of that experience, fleeting moments where we realize what this potential is and what we could achieve if we stick to it. And so many of us try and chase that in our careers. And it leads nicely on to my favorite Ninja Turtle.
Hey, I'm Michelangelo.
No, this Michelangelo.
Perfecto.
And what he can teach us about getting out of his comfort zone. And this is crazy, and I didn't know this at all about him, but he was someone who actually didn't want to do that, which is nuts. He saw himself as a sculptor, not a painter. So maybe you already see where this is going. Now, the Pope at the time, Julius II, thought only Michelangelo could paint the Sistine Chapel, when Michelangelo and everyone else was like, nah, we don't agree. But the Pope had this belief and this authority too to sort of force Michelangelo into it. And when Michelangelo and everybody around him doubted and really resisted this, he finally accepted the challenge. And maybe not wanting to be shamed, maybe letting his ego kind of step in, he dove in, and not even knowing if he could do it, he decided he would just go all in or fail so spectacularly people would laud him for kind of trying. And did he fail? No, he created one of the most iconic achievements in art history in the Sistine Chapel frescoes, which is nuts. We still talk about it today. And kind of what it teaches us is that sometimes it can take somebody else's belief to push us into work we'd never even attempt alone. And that pressure can maybe reveal potential we didn't even know we had. And that perhaps resistance as well, recognizing it and knowing it's a hurdle to overcome before perhaps experiencing that flow state and getting that taste of that sense of enlightenment, which is, by the way, it's not a concept in the book, but something I've kind of concluded. It can be such a powerful thing. So I guess what can we do? Well, we can follow the teachings of a lot of these artists. But also, if we want to change society for the better, Will Gompertz actually shares this really interesting story at the end of the book about all schools should be art schools. It's a painting by Bob and Roberta Smith, who's actually a single person. It's a painting they did to draw attention to the power of thinking like an artist. It's not actually literally to make everyone be an artist, but to adopt more of an art school approach in education is basically the message. And it's in the way art schools encourage open ideas, open thought and problem solving, and bringing together disparate ideas to solve problems. And the power that it gives people to be empowered and independent and capable of thought and imagination as tools to solve problems, not just sweating and frustrating and getting angry. I think as a parent then I've noticed that sort of that really lacking in any sort of formal sense in the education system in the country I live in the UK. I'm sure a lot of people on the face of this would look at that and go, well, that's ridiculous. Not everyone wants to be an artist, we shouldn't force them to. But adding in arts education and adopting that sort of approach into education of having an open mind, I think it could really change a lot of the way people think and the world for the better. And maybe make people more tolerant and understanding of each other too. I think a lot of prejudice comes from a lack of understanding of each other and a reluctance to take in new information.
I think it's important to remember also that there are so many people covered in this book, and I've sort of talked about a few of the people who've really made me think differently about things, and some more that aren't in the book today. But the really important lesson here is don't get overwhelmed by everything in the book. Take away what it is for you that stands out. There are so many different people he covers that I didn't speak about that are definitely worth checking out. And like I did, look beyond it as well.
But I think that's why I agree with Will Gompertz that thinking like an artist, even just a little more, can make you and everyone else around you at least a little more creative and productive even, and I think probably a lot happier overall too. Now, as well as being able to think like an artist, I think the other fascinating aspect of this is then how you and your brain react to being exposed to art and how powerful that is. There have been scientific studies that have shown just how incredibly impactful this can be on you and your health and your sort of mental well-being. And so I've been working on a video all about this. There's a book called Your Brain on Art. I would highly recommend having a look at that and before you watch. And when that is done, when I finish making that video, I'm going to put that right here. And if after watching all of that and listening to all of that, you're inspired to take some of the lessons from those artists and go out and create something, then I'll put something else up here which is far more designed to sort of help inspire you to get out there and create stuff. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope that was helpful. Take care, and I look forward to seeing you again next time. Bye.